So the book that I chose to read for this assignment is Friends for Freedom, the story of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. There's a little page here. No one thought Susan and Frederick would become friends. Susan B. Anthony was born in a two-story home with polished wood floors. Frederick Douglass was born in a one-room cabin with floors made of clay. Susan's parents taught her to read before she started school. Frederick secretly taught himself to read because slaves weren't allowed to go to school. Susan spent her days helping her mother, baking, sewing, and gardening. Frederick spent his days obeying his master, chopping, plowing, and planting. When Susan and Frederick were growing up, America was growing up too, and this young country had some strange ideas about friendship. It wasn't proper for women to be friends with men. You weren't supposed to be friends with someone whose skin was different color than yours. But Susan and Frederick knew these ideas were wrong, and when they grew up, they helped America grow up too. Their story began in the fall of 1849, when Susan quit teaching and moved home to the family farm near Rochester, New York. Before she even unpacked her bags, Susan hopped back into the wagon, grabbed the reins from her father, and drove those horses straight into town. She couldn't wait to meet the man her father talked so much about, the man who made a daring escape from slavery, gave eloquent speeches about equality, and stood up for women. When Frederick found Susan at his door, his smile lit up all of Alexander Street. He heard quite a bit about her too, the brave woman who gave powerful speeches about equality, the woman who wasn't afraid to complain that male teachers were paid 4 times more than women to do the same job. Before you could say liberty and justice for all, Frederick invited Susan inside and brewed up a pot of his finest tea. As the tea cooled down, their conversation heated up. They both hated slavery and thought one person should never own another. They believed women deserved the same rights as men, to own land, go to college, and to vote. And they weren't afraid to stand up for their beliefs. In fact, they loved a good fight. So the two became friends and decided to fight for equal rights for African Americans and women, together. But would this odd friendship last? Their friendship lasted when others laughed. People pointed and made fun of Susan and Frederick when they went out together. Whites and blacks weren't supposed to be friends. It just wasn't right for a black man and a white woman to be seen together in public. But Susan and Frederick didn't care what others said, behind their backs or to their faces. They were friends, no matter what. Their friendship lasted when rotten eggs flew. Susan and Frederick visited nearby towns to share their ideas. Everyone deserves to be treated the same, they declared, but when they met lots of enemies, people willing to do anything to stop them. Reporters wrote nasty stories saying that Susan and Frederick were like terrible sickness, a deadly smallpox, a horrible plague. Angry crowds pelted them with rotten eggs. You two are crazy, and your ideas are crazy too. But nothing could stop the two friends. Their friendship lasted when danger drew near. In 1861, Susan and Frederick headed to New York's capital, Albany, to speak out against slavery. More than 100 people signed a petition to keep them out of the city. "Those radicals will cause riots," they cried. "They'll embarrass our fine town." But the two came anyway, and they brought more speakers with them. That day, the meeting hall was packed. Most people weren't there to listen. They'd come to scare the unwelcome visitors away. "I don't want any trouble," the mayor announced, placing a gun on his lap for all to see. Susan and Frederick bravely faced a loud, angry mob. Bloody brawls and fistfights broke out around them. Through it all, the two friends kept speaking. Their friendship lasted when timbers flared. 4 years later, the 13th Amendment finally ended slavery. Susan and Frederick celebrated, then got right back to work. In 1869, newspaper headlines shocked the nation. The newly proposed 15th Amendment could give black men the right to vote, but not women. The country was in an uproar. Everyone took sides. Frederick was thrilled. Susan was furious. They got into a fight, a real whopper. With us, the matter is a question of life and death. Frederick insisted. Women must stand back and wait? Susan cried. They argued and shouted. Worse yet, they fought in public with everyone watching. But Susan and Frederick kept listening to one another. In time, they realized that they could disagree and still be friends. So they stopped fighting each other and were soon fighting side by side again. Their friendship lasted when fires burned. In 1872, hungry flames devoured Frederick's house while he was away on business. It was started by an arsonist who didn't want African Americans in their town. The blaze destroyed nearly everything: books, furniture, and even farm animals. Frederick's wife and children barely escaped with their lives. When Frederick rushed back to Rochester, he found his family homeless, standing beside charred bricks and ashes. He decided to move to Washington, D.C. to fight for equality where the laws were made. Stay, Susan pleaded, hoping he'd rebuild the town they shared for over 20 years. But Frederick's mind was made up, so the two friends said goodbye and promised to stay close. Their friendship lasted even when they were apart. Separated by hundreds of miles, Susan and Frederick wrote each other long letters. My dear old friend, Susan's note began. Yours for the freedom of man and women always. Frederick wrote back. They read about each other in newspapers. They bounced down rocky roads to give speeches together. They chugged across states to see one another at conventions, and their friendship stayed as strong as ever. Their friendship lasted for over 45 years. Through good times and bad, Susan and Frederick remained friends. Together they saw many of their dreams come true. African American men proudly stood in voting lines. Women packed their bags and headed off to college. African Americans and women worked jobs that were once only for white men. No one thought Susan and Frederick would become friends, but it's a good thing they did, because when they grew up, they shared a lasting friendship, one that helped America grow up too. The end.